Welcome to Heritage at Home, a series where we think about history, heritage, and all things digital. Today, we're looking at an interesting reconstruction of Edinburgh in the 1540s and the history and archaeology which inspired it. I'm Beth Rhodes, and I'm joined today by an exciting panel of guests. So we're really lucky to have a range of people with different expertise. We've got the historian, Amy Blakeway, who's lecturer in Scottish history at the University of St Andrews. Hi, Amy.
Hello, Beth. Lovely to see you. Hi.
Hi, well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We've also got the archaeologist, David Caldwell, who's formerly keeper of Scottish collections at the National Museum of Scotland, and he's been doing a lot of research on Scotland in the 1540s. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Lovely to see you. Thank you. We're also honoured to have John Lawson, who's the City of Edinburgh Council's archaeologist and knows all the things that have been being dug up in Edinburgh of late. Hello, John.
Hello. Well, that's a big ask there, but I'll try my best. Thank you.
Welcome. Great to have you here. And we're also delighted to have the historian Perrin Westhoff-Nyman, who's a doctoral researcher at St Andrews and has done some really interesting work on dress and processions and royal festivities in Edinburgh. Hi, Perrin.
Hi, Beth, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Welcome. It's great to have you. And I'm also delighted to be joined by my Open Virtual Worlds colleagues from the University of St Andrews. I've got Dr. Alan Miller here. Hi, Alan.
Hi, very pleased to meet you.
Yeah, so Alan's lecturer in digital heritage, and we're also delighted to have my colleague in research fellow Ian Oliver here, who is going to be master of all things technical and hopefully making sure it all runs smoothly. So thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you.
Brilliant. So thank you for joining us. And if you've got questions and things, please do send them to us during this and we'll try and answer. Then we've got a Q&A at the end. So please join in the discussion. But before we dive into the really exciting conversation I want to have about the history and archaeology of 16th century Edinburgh, I would like to share a little bit about the Edinburgh 1544 project. And Ian, can you get us up the reconstruction? We can maybe have a little taster of what it's like and the digital project which sort of has inspired this conversation in some ways. So, Edinburgh 1544 project was a project that our research team at St Andrews was involved in, and we completed it in 2017, so 3 years ago now. And it was focused on the Scottish capital in the 1540s. And we had a number of outputs from it. We had a digital reconstruction, which you're seeing yourselves in here. We're just by the, shall we go in the other direction? That's brilliant. If we can head into town, that's perfect. Brilliant. So we're just by the Netherbow Gate, which was a big gate separating the main borough of Edinburgh from the suburb of Canongate. And we're just going into the main borough here. We're going up the Royal Mile at the moment. So we did this reconstruction, and there was also an app and some other outputs from the project. And as we fly up the Royal Mile at the moment, Alan, I was wondering, can you hear me? Would you be able to tell us a little bit about the Edinburgh 1544 project and the vision behind it?
Well, thanks for asking that. Asking me that, Beth. The Edinburgh 1544 project was part of the Virtual Time Binoculars project, and it's actually a while ago now we started this. It was 4 years ago, and I remember writing the proposal with Katie Stevenson, and also remember a meeting. I also remember a meeting earlier on where three of us met together: Richard Fawcett and Sarah Kennedy, Bess, and myself, and we were kind of planning out what to do, because the original proposal was, well, we're going to do like a street or a couple of streets, and we kind of said, well, you know, why don't we do the whole of Edinburgh? And we kind of looked at ourselves as thinking, no, well, we're all mad, but we all kind of took the bit, and like a year afterwards, this is what we had, a reconstruction of Edinburgh as it was in 1544.
It's really exciting how it works out. It's been really great sharing it with sort of schools, sharing it with heritage organisations and with the general public. Now, we're currently travelling along a bit, but relatively near to St Giles, by the Luckham booths, going up now by the toll booths, which was effectively Edinburgh's town hall. Should we turn around and look back? Yeah. There we go. We've got the toll booth there, and we've also got a view back towards St Giles. So we're right in the heart of Edinburgh here, where we are. And the toll booth is actually really important. They sometimes held Scottish parliaments there. So this is a place of huge significance for Scotland. Now, this is just a taster of things, and we'll be giving you tips from the reconstruction going on. But we've just mentioned we decided to try and do a reconstruction of Edinburgh. We thought maybe originally about doing something on medieval Edinburgh, but slipped a little bit later to 1544. And 1544 was quite an important year for Edinburgh's history. It's quite momentous, quite a lot of upheaval in that year. Because that year, Edinburgh was attacked by an English army. And I think we've actually got a drawing of that attack in. Can we get that up? So we're going to get a drawing up, which was done by an English military engineer called Richard Lee. And if any of you are familiar with Berwick-upon-Tweed, that's the big defences there were partly designed by Lee. Have we got the picture? Well, I'm sure we'll get it soon. But Richard Lee was with the English forces, and he did a drawing of Edinburgh in 1544 and of English forces attacking Edinburgh, and it's one of the earliest representations of the Scotland's capital. So it's a really, really interesting, exciting source from the 1540s, from someone who was an eyewitness who visited Edinburgh, albeit in rather violent and uncomfortable circumstances. So here we've got the drawing, and it's currently in the collection of the British Library. And so it was created by someone who's in the forces who attacked Edinburgh in 1544. As this image really formed an inspiration for the project and will be a focus of a lot of what we'll be talking about today. Start off though, let's go back to the historic context. I was wondering, Amy, could you maybe talk us through why did the English want to attack Edinburgh in 1544? And perhaps also maybe tell us a little bit about what the young Mary Queen of Scots has to do with all of this.
Great, I'd love to, Beth. Thanks for asking. Okay, so to understand 1544, we've got to go back to 1503, when King James IV of Scotland, one of sort of the most kind of, I suppose, glamorous, lad about town kind of kings we've ever had, married Margaret Tudor, elder sister of Henry VIII, daughter of Henry VII. And, you know, that was obviously, as with all of these marriages amongst monarchs at this time, diplomatic marriage. And it was very important because what that did was that united the royal families of England and Scotland. And what that meant was if Henry VII's sons, Henry VIII, died without any children, then the line of succession would pass up to the Scots. Now, this was a big deal because England and Scotland have not had the most calm set of relations. You know, if they lived in modern Edinburgh today, they would certainly be contacting the council regarding neighbourly disputes. Let's put it that way. So when you have this Anglo-Scottish dynastic marriage, it means the English are going to be really interested in and anxious about the possibility of a king coming down from Scotland, a monarch coming from Scotland to rule over England. And of course, with Henry VIII's break from Rome, his removal from the Catholic Church, I don't want to get into this too much, but suffice to say, Henry VIII's marital problems mean that it looks really quite likely that the English are going to end up in a situation where their king dies and they don't have a legitimate monarch. Meanwhile, in Scotland, there's James V, son of James IV. King's had a little bit of a bad rep amongst some historians, but I know, Beth, certainly speaking to you, and Perrin also speaking to you, you know, we see that, you know, he's one of those kind of bad boys you're warned off, but actually on closer investigation, heart of gold, absolute heart of gold. So James V, a monarch who is undergoing historical reassessment. Now, during the 1530s, England is becoming a bit of a pariah in terms of Europe. Henry VIII has broken from the Catholic Church. He's broken thousands of years of tradition, thousands of years of history. He's cut off England's ancient diplomatic ties. He's divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The English are looking like a pariah state. In contrast, and Henry VIII's weight is growing hugely. We're beginning to see it's kind of the tyrant at the end of Henry VIII's reign emerging. James V, by contrast, is Catholic Europe's poster boy. He's young, he's active, he's got a glamorous court. He marries the daughter of the King of France. She dies, he makes another diplomatic alliance with France, and the Pope rewards him with gifts that the Pope has personally blessed. And so James is looking like he could really be a very serious challenge to his English uncle, and the English don't like this at all. So in 1542, when James dies, this presents the English with a big opportunity. The circumstances of James's death are really quite dramatic. He dies, and obviously the then question is who's going to rule Scotland? Well, the good news is he's got an heir. The bad news is, yeah, and let's have a picture of her. Let's see Mary. So he's got an heir, Mary, Queen of Scots, but the bad news is she comes to the throne aged 6 days old, and she's supposed to rule a country. Clearly, provisions need to be made for how Scotland's going to be ruled. And Henry VIII says, all right, I'll do it. I'll rule Scotland. I'll act as regent. And the Scots effectively say, no, thanks. We're not so keen on that. We've got our own regent in place. They've got the Earl of Arran, one of Mary's cousins, an heir to the throne, in place instead. But Arran's in a difficult position because he's very aware that the English are extremely strong militarily. He's very aware that he needs to build a new regime. He's very aware he's in a weak position. So he says to Henry VIII, you know, he doesn't let Henry VIII rule Scotland, but he says, all right, you know, I will get engaged with some of your demands, and I would consider Mary marrying your heir. The man who's going to go on to become.
We have a picture of, so we've got a little picture of Mary Queen of Scots when she's a bit older, and when she's about
Edward VI, also a little bit older. So Arran agrees, and he gets most of the Scottish nobility to agree for Mary to marry Edward, and he does that sort of at the start of 1543, so within 6 months of James VI dying. And this is a good move because the English army is not going to invade Scotland. It's removed the threat of war. However, it's not a move that many Scots are comfortable with. They're not happy with the idea of moving towards Protestantism. They're not happy with the idea of an English alliance. They would much prefer to continue the traditional Catholic faith, the traditional French alliance. And by the end of the year, when Arran has been able to secure support from France, when the political situation in Scotland has changed and stabilised, he breaks the treaty of marriage between Mary and Edward. And at that point, the English say Henry VIII is really quite cross. He says, you know, you've broken the treaty, and war breaks out again the following year with a large English army invading Edinburgh. So to sum it up, Henry VIII is being really opportunistic here. He's using the excuse of the broken treaty to push for things he's wanted for quite a while. Control of Scotland himself, the chance to impose his new religion on Scotland, and so close off this dangerous threat to his new religion of Protestantism on the same landmass as his own country. So this is about an exertion of English power, English supremacy, and Protestantism in one package.
So much for that, Amy. That's fantastic, and real insight into the hugely complex range of factors which led to war in the 1540s, and so a whole range of different things coming together. So we've got a situation where Henry VIII is pretty cross, and he dispatches an army north to wreak havoc in Edinburgh and show them, in his words, sort of the vengeance of God on people who break their promises. Now, Ian, I think we've got a picture of the man who led the English army. We've got a picture of the Earl of Hertford here, not a particularly brilliant portrait, but he's leading the English forces up, and he's Henry VIII's brother-in-law. And he's got quite a lot of troops at his disposal, and he arrives up in Scotland in the spring of 1544. David, are you there? Can you hear me? Hi.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
David, oh, fantastic, brilliant. David, I was wondering, could you fill us in a little bit, like this English army heads up to Scotland in the spring of 1544. Can you fill us in a bit on sort of what happens when they reach to Scotland and what happens to Edinburgh?
Right, okay. So the army lands at Granton. It takes Leith, sets up camp there. And then
You've actually got a drawing which shows, it's a slightly later drawing from the late 1540s, but it shows the relationship between Leith and Edinburgh at that time, actually.
Okay.
Ian, Can we get that up? Yeah, brilliant. Carry on. Yes, we've got Leith at the bottom of the page and Edinburgh at the top of the page. Sorry to interrupt, David. Carry on.
Okay, so the army takes Leith, sets up camp there, and then moves in Edinburgh, move into Edinburgh. They burn it. They cause a lot of devastation, not just in Edinburgh, but in all the surrounding area. And then they march away again. That is the basic story. And there's a lot of contemporary documentation, which gives a lot more detail. But as one might be used to with this period and this sort of material, the sources are not all totally consistent. And the English accounts often contain different information or different nuances than the rather fewer Scottish sources. And I believe that there's been more of a reliance on the official English versions of what happened rather than looking more objectively at the Scottish accounts.
Yeah.
Let's face it, Hertford's instructions from Henry VIII were to destroy Edinburgh and St Andrews and to take Edinburgh Castle. You might say he notably failed in the objectives he had been given. Worse than that, he never put his very expensive, cumbersome siege train to real use, but in fact had to abandon one of his major guns. And it's rather interesting reading his official letter, if you like, back to his king, which says, well, basically it wasn't my fault. My men were too quick and they rushed it up the hill and it was destroyed by the Scots before I could do anything about it. Right, okay. So I think it's very important that, and you know, when it comes to the burning of the town itself, the English enter Edinburgh with difficulty. They may have been pushed back in the first assault on the 6th of May, and they tried to set fire to the place, and it appears it didn't totally work. So they had to go back to Edinburgh the next day and do yet more burning. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to actually look minutely at some of these sources and try and tease out what really happened, and hopefully be able to involve a lot of archaeological evidence as well.
I think, Therese, this is one of the fascinating things about it. It's a dramatic moment because obviously you've got the sort of the capital in peril, and you've got foreign forces at the your capital and actually on the streets of your capital in some points. So like this is something which is quite disruptive, and yet so much of the writing about it, so many of our records are things which were almost internal propaganda because Hertford's got to have good back with Henry VIII back at home and like saying, no, you didn't, like you should have trusted me, it was all right, I did make good use of the resources you gave. So yeah, it's a really interesting, there's like sort of what happened then, but there's also this really interesting, how do we understand the record? Amy, what do you think? Do you think 1544 is a devastating moment for the Scottish capital, or should we be viewing it in different light?
I think it's to sort of talk about it as a devastating moment, kind of think about every single aspect. I think in terms of morale and in terms of fear, we can't underestimate this. And if we look a little wider than Edinburgh, places like Aberdeen, as soon as they hear the English troops have landed, are making provisions. So it is definitely a moment where the country as a whole wakes up to the threat of what an English invasion could be. Aberdeen, for example, commission a large chain to put across the harbour to blockade the possibility of any English ships coming out. In Perth, they're worried because if you can get a boat up to Edinburgh, you can get a boat a bit further up and then you can get it down the Tay, and that would take you straight in to the heart of Scotland. There is anxiety about the English forces potentially reaching Stirling and being able to capture the infant queen. So psychologically, I think, and in terms of practical preparation, it's a hugely important moment, not just for Edinburgh, but for all of Scotland. But I think David's right. When we step away from English sources and we start looking at Scottish accounts, it's quite clear that Hertford is exaggerating what he's doing and the men with him are exaggerating what they're doing. And I think, in fact, when we look at those accounts, remember, these are written by soldiers. It's part of a kind of broader genre of soldiers bigging up their own events. And we see the same with the French accounts written about the campaigns in Scotland. They want to make themselves sound like the saviour of the Scots.
Absolutely.
That said, I do think that 1544 has an important implication for Scottish history generally. The English do get into Holyrood. They do get into Canongate. Holyrood's the royal palace. Canongate is where a lot of the big houses are, where a lot of the really rich and wealthy establishments in Edinburgh are. And what that means is the English have the possibility of looting. And we know that the English are sent to Scotland, and in the instructions that David's already alluded to, there's a lot of emphasis on burning stuff. There's also an emphasis on sacking Scottish books, because the English are looking for proof that Scotland has always been a feudal tributary of England, by which that means the King of England should be overlord of Scotland. So the English are sent partly with an agenda to try and think about getting a hold of any Scottish books or destroying Scottish books, which would have implications for their claims to be overlords of Scotland. And so I think actually the English invasion of Edinburgh has a big implication in terms of the sources available for historians in Scotland. And David said our sources are patchy. I think this is partly, in fact, to do with the burning. If you look at the council registers and the court books for the later 1540s and the 1550s, there is a huge number of cases where individuals are saying, I don't have the title deeds to this. I don't have this marriage contract. I don't have this decision on a court ruling that you've given me because it was lost in the burning times. Now, some of these might be a slightly more dramatic version of the dog ate my homework, but I think the fact the excuse is used so often shows it's believable. And we certainly know that there are Scottish books that survive in large numbers in English archives. The man who owned Speke Hall on the Wirral, for example, sacked a load of books, and he wrote in the front of them, taken by me from Edinburgh, May 1544. And we also know that some of the objects in and around Edinburgh and in other places where the English army were taken as well. So I think, although the burning might not have been as great, and I think we're right to have that revision, we also need to remember the huge implications that this has for our source base and our understanding of Edinburgh as a rich, intellectually vibrant, materially luxurious European capital.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. The problems with the sources from a historical perspective, which this all presents, and how that affects things more generally to do with Scottish history. I think I would like to turn now and think maybe a bit more about the capital that the Scots defended in 1544 and sort of the urban community that was there. Could we have our next little clip? Would that be all right? So we're going to see a video, and this is actually covering some of the areas which were quite significant. We're standing right by the Netherbow, which was sort of the entry to the borough of Edinburgh proper, and which actually did have quite a significant role to play. There was quite a bit of fighting around here in 1544, according to some of the accounts. And then we will move up into the Royal Mile, the High Street, moving up in the direction of St Giles, coming along here. So you can see actually it must have been quite challenging, sort of, when we think about fighting today, sort of in urban environments, actually quite challenging in the 16th century in some ways as well. And we saw leaping a bit further into town here, we've got coming up to the Buttertron, and then we're going to go down a side street, which in point of fact has now changed a lot and doesn't really exist in this form at all. The West Bow, which sort of major 19th century alterations changed this. So you can no longer do this route, but it used to be a link through between the Grassmarket and the Royal Mile. So we're bending down, winding our way down into the Grassmarket. So all of these names, for people who know Edinburgh today, they'll be familiar names to you. Okay. So I'd like to we've got quite a lot of thought about what happens in 44, but I'd like to think about what we can learn from maybe some of the drawings and things of Edinburgh about that period and about the townscape at that time. Okay, if we can go on to look back at the detail from the Lee plan, that would be fantastic. That'd be great. Brilliant. Fantastic. So we've got a detail from the map we saw earlier, sort of honed in a bit on the actual borough of Edinburgh and the Canongate. And so down the left-hand end of this picture, we've got Holyrood, and on the right-hand end, just sort of concealed out of sight, we've got Edinburgh Castle. John, can you hear me at the moment?
Yes, hi.
Fantastic, that's great. John, I was wondering, could you maybe tell us a bit about sort of the area Edinburgh covered and sort of rough layout in the 16th century?
Yeah, I will do, but just to pick up though on some of the points David and Amy are picking up. Unfortunately, the 16th century has seen a few, shall we say, raids by the English and Protestant armies over the piece. So, but in terms of archaeology, trying to find that, not the puns, smoking gun, or shall we say, smoking cannon into place. We are actually finding some archaeological material of sieges and warfare from the 16th century. Unfortunately, like most of archaeology, we can only say it's in the 16th century. We can't really, as David and the rest will say, we can't really tell the difference between 1544, unfortunately, and probably the one we focus on more, which is again the Earl of Hertford, coming up about 15 years later in 5960. But from Leith, we do have, I've excavated in the 90s myself, 2 sites which have one associated with a large burning episode of the 16th century. It does produce cannonballs as well. And we also, from another site, we did it in the burning, we had a cannonball in situ. It's very small of the stone cannonballs of the type. And we are getting the odd cannonball of, shall we say, 16th century, early 17th century, turning up throughout excavations in the Canongate and Edinburgh, the odd one. But unfortunately, we don't have, or we have yet to see, certainly in Edinburgh and the Canongate, large swathes of burning.
That's interesting.
Which is something to look for, but we're just not seeing, which seems to tie in with the historical evidence of people coming in, ransacking it, but not necessarily burning it down. Most of the real rebuilding of Edinburgh seemed to happen in the second half of the 16th century. More possibly associated after the 1559, 60 and 71, I believe, sieges of Leith in particular. In terms of Edinburgh, it's what you're seeing in this map is really the combination of Edinburgh sort of starts off in the 12th century. We have the Wars of Independence in the 13th century. And what we're seeing from a fantastic excavations just completed last summer, India buildings on the back of the graph, I'll get into a minute, is really the town developing over 200 years. And what you're seeing in that picture is effectively a classic medieval, the end of a classic medieval landscape of town planning, set by one of our great kings, David I, much forgotten about. So basically, we've got a mile long, got Edinburgh Castle at the top end, the Royal Mile, as you say, down to Holyrood Abbey, covering the 2. It's in fact actually about 3 or 4 different streets, shall we say, making up the main high street. Then either side, Edinburgh medieval high street, effectively got the west end Edinburgh Castle and St Cuthbert's Church, which is just below the picture at Prince Street Gardens. For those who maybe come up, Prince Street Garden was the Norloch for this period.
If we go on to the next image, we can see the Norloch nicely on the next image. So this is when we're talking, what we're saying about how there's lots of conflict and there's a number of battles, well, not battles, there's number of sieges, number of military incidents, which might have affected the city. This is one of slightly later one. It's one of the siege of the castle in the early 1570s. But rather beautifully, in the middle of it, you can see the Norloch in the middle.
Yeah, just under Edinburgh. So basically, it's quite a long. That's one end. That's sort of basically Prince Street Gardens. So the south side of Prince Street Gardens is the end of the town, effectively. And then, if you look at the south side of the town, I think you might see
Actually, if you want to click on to the next one, we've got one which
it's probably a bit
outside of town.
This is Rothermere, which is 1647, a fantastic image, but it shows a sort of really confined space of Edinburgh, lots of linear, very small side streets, closes as we call them up here in Pens. But what it shows is basically Edinburgh University, for those who know Edinburgh, forms really the south side of it, is at the bottom of the picture, though it's not yet to be built under the old quadrangle. But what you're seeing is a basically a valley. You can't quite see in the picture. It's basically a valley. The main road, you got with St Giles Cathedral, is the high street. To the south of that, you got the Grass Market to the west, or to one side. Then you got another road that goes up, which is the Cowgate, which forms the medieval boundary up until probably about 1400 or so. And then what you got is this development out towards Edinburgh University and what becomes known as the Flodden Wall, rebuilding in 1413. But it's looking like it's getting all three major religious establishments. You can see the church, which is later Greyfriars, but on site of an earlier medieval monastery. You got the Blackfriars. So you're looking at monastic buildings on another high ground overlooking the main high street. It's almost very similar to layouts. I was in Budapest, Zagreb a few years ago. It's got that sort of look to it. But also you got what you're seeing is also the town developing out, just outside. You got all the suburbs with industry. And it's something that you're not really seeing in these images at all. They've been really cramming in occupation and heavy industry in certain zones, and a really dynamic place.
It's just, so many different facets to the community, which is really interesting. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. David, do you think we've just looked at some really lovely pictures of Edinburgh, and we're really lucky in the case of Edinburgh, unlike quite a few other 16th century urban communities in Scotland, to have some early drawings, which is so cool. Do you think these are like realistic representations, or do we have to take them with a pinch of salt? Sorry, have I lost David? We can charge, can you hear me? Or shall we charge on?
Well, if I can answer slightly.
Go for it, John, please go for it, thank you.
So in terms of Rothermere, there was an art, that is almost a proper representation of what it was done. That was done with somebody who knew the town, the individuals are right, and there's been work, a paper a couple of years ago, we actually looked at draped that plan on a modern layout, and it effectively fits. So what you're seeing there is Edinburgh in 1640 a realistic proportion of it. So you can trust this. What you can't trust is actually the smaller detail, but it gives you the layout.
But from our perspective, it's quite interesting because this is a brilliant picture of what it's like in the 1640s, but we were trying to reconstruct the 1540s, and there's this big question, how much do things change?
Probably not that much in terms of layout. I think probably more stone buildings now than it would have been back in the 1540s. But if you look at that layout would have been almost similar, though the couple of buildings, big buildings aren't there, but the layout would have been the same as it was in 1540s.
That's brilliant. That's great. Ian, could we click on to a bit of St Giles? Because we really, I think one of the interesting things for us when we were working on the project was we both worked on some very familiar sites like St Giles, which very much remained landmarks, St Giles, Holyrood Palace, the castle, but all the tourists still flock to them. But then there's also some sites which we've completely lost, like the Netherbow, or if we're looking down more towards where Waverley Station now is, things like Trinity College and things, which are really interesting sites which have completely gone. But I'd like to think maybe a little bit about sort of how some of the sites which we're familiar with, like St Giles, perhaps had rather a different setting at the time. Ian, do you want to show us the video? There's a little video. So there is quite a lot of imaginative interpretation in this video, but there is also some elements that maybe tie into some things that, John, you've been researching. So here we are. Can you see there's a graveyard in the background, and we're sort of moving up the hill, keep on glimpsing the graveyards behind St Giles, then we're moving up towards it. John, you've been doing some really interesting work. And there's been some fascinating research done in the St Giles area. Yeah. Archaeologically. Could you maybe share a little bit about that with us?
There's been a few excavations over the last, well, the first one was actually inside the church we'll talk about in a minute. But in terms of, around about 2000, AOC were looking at a site. Basically, what we're showing is, you see that today. Today, you saw from the Rothermere map, it's all built up. But the original medieval parish graveyard, you can just see going through there. We have a large open space right in the centre of the town. And effectively what we have is a graveyard from 1460. Well, the parish graves are, I'll start again. You've got the church itself established in the early 12th century, possibly on the site of an earlier one on a nice ground. It's been rebuilt constantly throughout the medieval period, expanded to what roughly about the same size as today. But what you have to see it in today as a church or a cathedral, shall we say, within a graveyard, possibly circular, maybe, who knows at the time. And then in 1460, town's population is standing, and there's a massive graveyard all the way down to the Cowgate, which is now taken over by the courts, the High Courts and the Parliament building. So it would have been a fantastic open space. Parish graveyard, the main parish graveyard for the town, the old town of Edinburgh, rather than the other ones, and it would have been, a very vibrant place of meeting, open space that we don't see today. Very much similar to what Greyfriars Church forms today, and that's an open space, green open space. And then, obviously, we've been excavating some human remains through development processes. So one of the things about St Giles Church for an archaeologist makes it really exciting is inside the church he's actually got a very good sequence of graveyards separated every 100 years from roughly about 1100 all the way through to around about 1560 when the graveyard moved, the parish church stopped interning, moved up to graveyards. And what you see today is a lot of forensic work we've been doing with looking at other stuff that we excavated in the 1980s. This is a very interesting woman. We haven't radiocarbon dated because she was excavated, say, in the 1980s, but she dates from the 15th century, possibly into the 16th century. She was buried in what we identified as the Chapel of St. Anne, who was a saint closely associated with sewing and a lot of issues relating to women. And what we think is possibly to be buried inside the church. And what you can see is actually interesting. She's actually got leprosy. This is a reconstruction we did with Karen Fleming, an intern from Dundee University's forensic school. And you can see the leprosy on her face, but obviously it's associated with poor people. This person would have been a rich merchant's or burgess's wife. She may even actually owned mills or wherever. To be buried in St Giles in front of the altar, along with 8 other women, is a sign of high status, and it's really interesting.
Absolutely.
Trying to get to grips with who these people are, putting a face to our ancestors, in fact. And we've been looking mostly with excavations in Leith, but also now working with archaeologists at Aberdeen, looking at the forensic work, isotopic, where people are coming from in this period. And it's looking at what they're eating. So just a flavour of, we're seeing a lot of the people are actually born and living it, coming from the Lothians and the local areas, with some outliers from the Highlands coming in and the West of Scotland. But what we're not finding is a large movement of people at the moment. Maybe because we're not looking in the right place, but hopefully we're going to have some of the results I haven't seen yet, and apparently some exciting discoveries come out of it.
It's so cool though, doing the work that means that we can put a face to the people who were living in the community, I think, and that's so important. Of course, one of the things our reconstruction doesn't actually have people in it. It's really great to have the faces.
And a lot of the people we're doing aren't the nobility. They're not necessarily your dukes and earls. These are the sort of middle classes and below, shall we say, and it's people who don't get represented.
It is, no, absolutely. I think that's sort of that aspect of the wider community is sort of what I want to come on to next. Ian, can we have the video with the next video, if that's possible? So this is kind of a reminder of all the things. We're down in the Grassmarket area here and going through. So we're going in a sort of a trading area, in an area where there's maybe some industrial activity in the back of the houses and things. Could you maybe John fill us in about some of the interesting stuff that you found behind the houses? Yeah,
if you could sort of stop there, Ian, if that's okay. The India building site that I was referring to, what you got is the Grassmarket has really been established as a major trading and hub of social activity, from at least probably the 14th century, if not possibly even earlier, but certainly from then. What you see, the road you're talking about is actually one of the main routes actually into the medieval, it may even be certainly, I think, dates the 10th or 11th century. What we're finding from excavations at India Building site, which is right behind the buildings you see in front of us on that image, is this area started off as an Anglo-Saxon or Scottish settlement town, and then development over 5 or 6 meters of archaeology until we're getting into the 15th and 16th century, where right behind what probably would have been merchants' houses and with shops and businesses at the ground floor level, but right behind that was a major tannery, looking at obviously processing tans from beginning to end, probably with the remains of the cattle that have been sold right in front of you, being just, you can just see maybe a little close in front of you, being taken down that close and butchered on site. The smells would have been horrendous. You got all the chemical processing going on. And there's actually evidence of maybe trying to finish that sort of hides on the site as well. The work's just, post-excavation analysis has not started fully yet, but I think once it's come on, we'll really get an idea of what's going on that site. But it's interesting you see that sort of posh frontage, but right behind it, tucked away, is some of the most horrendous industrial processes you have in a town. Smells would be horrendous.
It's fascinating.
The noise, and it's just getting that vibrancy that some of the official plans don't have.
It's so interesting, different layers. If we carry on exploring it while we're chatting, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. So we're sort of really interested in getting that picture of what's behind the street frontages. So you've got sort of a public face where people might go gazing and when they build their houses, and then out the back you've got all this working stuff, which is really interesting. And that this sort of dual purpose spaces, if we click onto the next image, Ian, that'd be great. These dual purpose spaces, which are sort of dwellings and trading, and which is sort of quite distinctive vernacular architecture, maybe with a bit of timber construction and things, very much continue for quite a long time in Edinburgh, really, until we have major clearing up and tidying in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then
almost right through to today. I mean, it's the constant process of urban renewal and development. Is not a new process. We can, as an archaeologist, we can trace this back, going back, well, since the start of urban living. Every so often it goes up, goes down, people move in, get different groups moving in, different industries moving in. But it's just quite interesting that this part of town, the Grass Market, has always had that sort of association with tanning and industry.
Yeah.
Through to the 19th century, with a massive, obviously the gaps in between, but the tannery works there, and the butcher slaughterhouses moved just down the road, the other end of the Grass Market, into the 19th century. So there's that continuity, and we're not even talking about the brewing industries and the silver, the massive heavier industries which have been on the outside of the town, like bronze making at this time, evidence for large metalworking, foundries coming up underneath Edinburgh University. So
it is. I mean, it's so important to remember this industrial aspect that was sustaining the borough and providing the service.
Yeah,
really important.
And it's
No,
I was just going to say, and some of the evidence we're getting is actually tying into what Amy and others were saying about the links, and we're getting evidence of the wealth of the town in the 16th century. With the artifacts coming up, we're getting barrels, 15th century, from Burgundy wine barrels from there in the Low Countries. We've got links with Baltic states trading coming in here. We've actually got evidence of what we call stove tiles, ceramic stove tiles. These are the sort of, your posh and Becks, and you're buying this in, because they cost fortunes to get these sort of central heating coming in, because they have to come in with the workers from the continent, and it brings back into that sort of rich middle class society, the upper else coming into town. And we've got more of these tiles in Edinburgh than anywhere else in Scotland so far. Yeah.
Which is amazing, and sort of kind of a tribute to the importance of Edinburgh. Yeah. And so 16th century Edinburgh, it really is significant. It has a huge economic and political significance. Yeah. Amy, could you fill us in a little bit on the sort of political significance that Edinburgh had by the 16th century?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Rhys. So the Edinburgh by this point is definitely the capital city. Edinburgh is it's becoming the place, it is a place where central government is increasingly focused. And I say increasingly because it's the 16th century, everything still trots around. But by the early 16th century, if you have got a legal case, you are going to come to Edinburgh to have it heard in the Court of Session if you're important enough and if the land involved is important enough. There's the Central Criminal Court, the Court of Session, like, yes, that Court of Session, the one that's still there today.
Yes.
The High Court of Justiciary, yes, that High Court, the one that's still there today. So this is where the central courts are. It's where, more often than not, you're going to meet the Privy Council. The kings and the monarchs still move around an awful lot, but Edinburgh is very much the home of the King's Council. And we've got good evidence that when kings and queens go on progresses throughout Scotland, council stays in Edinburgh. It's also, as we heard earlier, where parliaments are held, and you showed us the toll booth. So Edinburgh is also a site which isn't just important because courts are there, it's also where the community of the realm will gather. If we think about a parliament, you know, we sort of think of parliament as being something that's representative, and it's representative of all the people. The early modern concept of parliament is a little bit different. You don't, you know, sort of peasant Blakeway and peasant Rhodes don't really need to be sending their representatives, you know, they just need to kind of work the land and die in a sort of convenient and compliant manner. However, what you do need to do is make sure that all the lords, all of the important ecclesiastics, your archbishops of St Andrews, your earls of Murray, actually meet in person. So because Edinburgh is where Parliament is, and Edinburgh is where the Royal Court is, it's also where the whole political community of Scotland gather together to make important decisions, to raise taxes, to make laws, and so on. So it's hugely politically important as a place. And that, of course, means that Edinburgh Council is more than just a town council. Edinburgh Council is, of course, running as a normal borough council, and they do their fair share of kind of, you know, neighbourly disputes or sorting out because someone's left some nasty animal entrails in a place where it ought not to be. But they're also stage managing, and I say that term quite deliberately because I think this is a very theatrical political culture. They are also the stage managers for national politics. They are providing an environment within which national politics is happening. So Edinburgh is hugely significant from a number of levels. And, you know, when John was talking about all of this wealth that the capital has, you know, that is because there are all these important people here. You know, you don't make fancy pants luxury things unless someone's around to buy it. So Edinburgh's a really it's got, and then of course that money brings its own political clout as well. You've got a lot of the borough council are the leading lawyers, so it's this really kind of a little bit like modern Edinburgh perhaps. It's this really sort of, you know, kind of there's a town elite who mix in with that national political elite and kind of move between those two worlds very easily.
And while we're thinking of elite culture, Ian, could you click on to Holyrood Palace, which of course today is where the Queen has garden parties and things like that. But we've got to remember that this was actually also a residence at that point. So we've got more than one important royal base in Edinburgh. We've got obviously the castle at one end, and we've got Holyrood Abbey, where the Abbey in the 1540s was still an important religious institution. But Holyrood starting its long journey to evolving into being a royal residence. Perrin, are you there? Can you hear me?
I am. Hi, yes.
Hello. I was wondering, you've been doing some really, really interesting work into sort of major royal events in Scotland, some of which took place in Edinburgh. Could you maybe tell us a bit about that? While I think we're also going to click on to an older picture of the palace, which inspired some of our work. But so this is the palace in the 1640s, and maybe you could tell us some things that the palace, but also the wider borough of Edinburgh, were a backdrop for these big royal events.
Absolutely, yeah. I think Amy earlier mentioned some of the reasons why James V's magnificence had so much bearing on some of the events that happened in the 1540s. So I think it's useful to go back to some of the major celebrations that take place within Edinburgh and also within some of the other boroughs of Scotland, in particularly the 1530s and 40s, because this is a really significant time for James and for the development of royal pageantry. So when James goes to France, essentially to get the wife he actually wants, he goes on a several-week-long shopping spree, and we have French accounts of him sort of running back and forth through the streets of Paris, buying everything in sight, which from the Royal Treasurer's accounts is probably not an exaggeration. He brings back a lot of stuff. And not just small things either. He's buying yards and yards and yards of cloth of gold, of silk brocade, silk velvet, things like horse trappings, hangings for state beds, lots of furniture, tapestries, all sorts of items that, while there are opportunities to get these in Scotland and they're being imported otherwise, this is a chance for him to particularly choose what he wants and what he thinks represents him as a ruler. And then Madeleine also brings back a lot with her that her father, Francis I, has given her as part of that marriage settlement. So at that point, although we had very, very magnificent palaces and material culture prior to this, James IV and Margaret Tudor are not by any means insignificant in terms of their expenditure or their emphasis on luxury. But we do see James V putting his own stamp on this at this point. And that really changes, I think, or advances perhaps the material splendor of some of these areas. And that has a lot to do with the boroughs as well, because of course royal pageantry takes place in this environment. So we know, for instance, that at something like a royal entry procession, we would have had tapestries and hangings and so on decorating many of the houses within the borough. We know this from royal accounts and also from things like chronicles. And there's a cooperation between the royal officials and the borough officials in terms of making these occasions as splendorous as possible. And this is a really important point for the borough and the crown to have this discourse. And we know that both sides are sort of contributing to this in a material way. So for instance, for Marie de Guise's entry in 1538, we know that Edinburgh is sort of cleaned up, things are repainted. We know that a lot of the burgesses and so on were wearing very specific clothing. So keeping in mind that people within the borough are an aspect of this material splendor as well. We know from other types of processions that the guilds and crafts would have had banners and clothing that represented who they were. And we know that other people were also being required to come to these events in sort of the general terms, their best array, so the absolute finest clothing they could represent. And we know from the royal accounts, likewise, that the servants of the royal household were decorated, particularly in 1537 and in 1538, in party-colored clothing, so where one half of the clothing is a different color to the other half, of red and yellow, which are the royal heraldic colors. So we have this interplay of material splendor from both the crown and the borough that are really meeting together in these events. I think sorry, Beth.
That's so fantastic. Thank you so much. That's really interesting, giving that overview of the splendour and the pageantry and the spectacle, and of course remembering the borough as a place that was lived in and occupied. Ian, can we have the next video? Would that be all right? Our final video. That would be brilliant. So I think it's been so wonderful getting all these different insights on the borough. So here we are down at the Holyrood end, by the palace and by the abbey, which is the end which actually bore a lot of the brunt of the fighting in 1544. And we're moving up into town in the direction, in many ways, that the attackers came in 1544. But it's so helpful to have had this conversation, which is showing the international connections of Edinburgh. It's showing the political connections, but it's also showing the economic side and the sort of industrial side and the down and dirty side of Edinburgh. And that it was all of these things working together and interacting, which made it a vibrant and viable urban community. So here we are. So this is a reconstruction. We're coming in, we're coming up again towards the Netherbow, the divide between the Canongate and into the main borough of Edinburgh proper, into the heart of it. Coming up past the Tron, which was a weights associated with trade, coming up towards St. Giles here, and then looking out up towards the castle, still such a landmark today, and then looking down towards the Grassmarket and down towards a more industrial area of Edinburgh. So it's such, I mean, one of the so exciting things about working on this project, and it's so exciting hearing about all the different work that you're doing, is the way in which there's so many different aspects of 16th century Edinburgh that can be explored, and there's so many debates still to be had. In the light of the debates that are still to be had, I think we've probably got some questions for people. Alan, are you there? Can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you, Beth.
Alan, do we have some questions?
Well, I have to say we've had a very lively chat going on here, and lots of people kind of throwing in things with each other, kind of sparked by what we've been watching. But there are some questions as well. So one is, this is from Chelsea. Today we often think of Holyrood and Edinburgh Castle as the bookends of the tourist excursion on the Royal Mile. But what was the relationship between the two locations in 1544, particularly given the limits of the city walls?
What do people, has anyone got a burning desire to respond?
So I think in terms of kind of the royal purposes of those two locations, they are really quite different. So the castle obviously is a massive tourist attraction. But if you think about kind of where big events happen, they tend to be in Holyrood. And that's because the castle's quite functional in this period. So the castle is where you've got, there's a record house in there, so there are some records being kept in the castle. There's a very small chapel, St Margaret's Chapel, and the fact the chapel is small is quite revealing, because it shows us there cannot have been the entire court worshipping in that place at the one time. Instead, the castle's really very much a military location, so there's a captain of the castle, there's an expensive guard, it's where the royal gunners are based, it's where the crown's it's basically the Crown's military HQ, and right, you still go to the castle today, there's still that military heritage very strong. On the other hand, Holyrood at the other end of the Royal Mile is kind of the royal luxury palace. It's the pleasure palace. And Beth mentioned earlier the Queen's garden parties, and can I just say James V's garden parties? They would have been much better, much better. Oh. But anyway, the point is that Holyrood is the kind of luxury royal magnificence end. It's where you meet your ambassadors, you know, because you can take them around the garden that have got the beautiful plants that you've had imported. Oh, and my father-in-law, my wonderful father-in-law, the King of France, did I say I was related to the King of France? He sent me these beautiful things from France, where I've got relations in the royal family. Holyrood's where you can do your display. So the two sites have really developed very different functionality. And when you look at the expenditure on the accounts, if it's fancy paint, cloth of gold, Venetian glasswork, that is going to Holyrood. If it's more functional stuff, chances are it's going to the castle. So there's a real division of labour in terms of thinking about different parts of crown and governmental power between the two sites. That's very apparent by the reign of James V in the 1540s.
Right. I do have other questions coming on in here. Anna Turnham wanted to know, I wanted to ask about the Regent Arran's response to the English siege in terms of organising their nobility and preparing the city, and also how did the siege impact Edinburgh economically? And Stefan wants us to spare a thought for poor St Mary's Chapel in the castle, which is turned to munition house at this time.
Yeah. So I think who was
Oh, can I speak about that?
David, go for it, please do.
Oh, okay. So it's very clear that Arran was unprepared for this English invasion. He had tried to call out the troops, the Scottish army, but he wanted them to convene at Edinburgh, I think on the 5th of May, which was clearly too late. So the army that actually tried to oppose the English was too small, and it consisted of some of the burgesses, local lairds, and the nobility who happened to be in town with their retainers, and it was very ineffective. On the other hand, perhaps he hadn't meant it this way, by not actually having a sufficient army to stand up to the English army, he failed to give Hertford the victory, the battlefield success that he may seriously have wished for. So what was the other question?
So there's a question about economic.
Economic, yes. Right. So this gets back to the question of how devastating the destruction of Edinburgh. And it does not appear that there's much information to show that there was any lasting effect beyond the mid 1540s. So we say by 1547, there's no idea that, that we're dealing with a destroyed or ransacked city. So the economic impact may not have been as much as one might otherwise have thought. But this is one of the things that requires more, much more thought, it seems.
One of the things, of course, to bear in mind is we've got 44, but then there's actually more English attacks and more things happen late in the 1540s. I know Amy and you have both done quite a lot of research on things that happen later on in the 1540s as well. So yeah, it's that there's 44, but what happens from 44 and what happens from 47 and things, yeah.
It's very easy to get confused between the two. What we do know is that after the English invasion in 1547, there was a dramatic rise in the price of coal in Edinburgh, which I think results from the destruction of the Scottish coal mines over in the Lothians. Well, we don't really have any evidence of that sort for 1544, I don't think.
Yeah, I think I'd agree, David, in terms of kind of that the impact on 44. You know, Edinburgh is in some ways able to bounce back very quickly. But again, sort of link back to what you were saying a minute ago, Bess, when we view this as part of a longer campaign, I think that all of the campaigns of the 1540s cumulatively are hugely disruptive. And I think that one of the things that's really crucial to remember here is it's not just the kind of impact of the English army turning up and burning your stuff or taking your stuff, which is obviously not pleasant. It's also the consistent government tax demands, right? Because Arran is putting a higher tax burden on Scotland than it's experienced really at any point previously. There's a constant demand for tax. The government needs more and more and more money to resist this. In addition to which, local communities, as David's just outlined, have to prepare their own defences. It's not like you pay your tax to the governor, to Arran, and that's it, your defence is sorted. You've then got to source your own men, source your own, perhaps some mercenaries, certainly get your munition up to date. So I think there is definitely a drip effect. And again, looking elsewhere in Scotland, we know that communities like Aberdeen really feel they are suffering with the constant demands for more men, more money. And of course, when people are away, there's a level of economic disruption there as well. So I think even though, again, kind of the impact, perhaps the burning campaign of 1544 might have been quite constrained, contextually, I think the 1540s are a hugely problematic decade for Scotland, which we see through into the 1550s. And I think things like the inflation in that period, the way in which the church is having to engage in, you know, not very profitable land sales to try and get some kind of income together, shows that the country as a whole, and their capital as part of that, is under considerable economic strain and duress.
It's so exciting the way it all links together. It's so many different things. Alan, do we have time for maybe one more question? Alan, you're muted, I think.
I'll tell you what the questions are that I've got that are still kind of outstanding. So Christina Parker was wondering, can anyone speak a little more about what Leith would have looked like during this period? Was it simply a port? Would there have been many residents in the area, and so on? And there's also been some discussion about, so when did Edinburgh become the capital? What was the capital before, and when did it become a city? And also, I wanted to know, why is the grass market called the grass market?
Well, there are so many different questions in there.
Okay.
Obviously, we've had a bit of a chat about sort of the journey Edinburgh goes on to become a capital, with more and more important institutions located there, which the 16th century, it being quite a significant point at that stage. I was wondering, could we go back to the Leith question and maybe have that as the final one, which ties together the wider Edinburgh community we know today with what we sometimes think of as historic Edinburgh, the Royal Mile? Maybe, John, would you like to bit about Leith, maybe.
Yeah, well, Leith is probably at the time, looking at 100 years later, I don't have the statistics at the moment, but in 1644-5, the population of Leith was just over 5,000 people. We know that because half of them died in the plague over the winter of that year. Leith is intertwined really with Edinburgh. It's Edinburgh's port. I'm sorry, I have to apologise to my Leith constituents out there. It's set up very much as establishment goes hand in hand with the development of Leith. So by this period, you're looking at a very vibrant port. A lot of slightly smaller today. If people know Leith at all, it's quite hard. Leith was the major landmark. You got centred around the port of Leith, the actual river mouth, a tidal river. One side at this period would have been very much a very smaller shipbuilding, outfitting, almost like a small. It's on the sort of the western side of the river today, which was unconveniently North Leith, which goes back confusing between South Leith. South Leith was basically more of a town, very much mercantile, to do with the trading of it. So you probably had the main road coming down to Edinburgh, which is effectively Leith Walk today. If you go into if you come to Leith, the main development of it was to do with 50, 59, 60 and the fortifications, where we have Constitution Street, which runs down the back of the town. You have the New Kirk Gate, which was the main medieval high street going down into it, and then Great Junction Street was the end. And effectively, the siegers drew a line round Leith, which wasn't fortified at this time. It was open within a sort of dune system, sort of agrarian area. So it's very much smaller than we see, a lot smaller to see today, concentrated around the port. But it's without showing up, it's quite hard to describe. But
important to remember that it's the port and
yes, very much
point for all these international connections that we've been thinking about, and that Perrin spoke about, and you spoke about, and Amy, and very much lovely to end with this idea of Edinburgh as an international city all the way back in the 16th century. Some of its international connections weren't always 100% easy. Can I say, I'm so sorry, there's so much more I would love to discuss, but I think we are out of time. But can I say thank you to all the people who submitted questions. We really appreciate that. And thank you so much for our panel, to Amy Blakeway, to David Caldwell, to John Lawson, and to Perrin Westhoff-Nyman. You've all been absolutely fantastic. And we will be returning with more Heritage at Home, including David Caldwell's voice again, on June the 4th, on Thursday, June the 4th at 2 o'clock. We'll be back with another session, this time looking at the Lords of the Isles residents over on Finlagan on Islay, sort of another major political hub in Scotland, but over on the other side of the country. Thank you so much and stay safe. Thank you.